Sometimes the bravest thing a mother can do is run away. Sometimes love means choosing the street over a house that feels like a prison. Grace sat on that park bench at sunrise, barefoot and shivering, her hands protecting the life growing inside her. She had escaped in the night from a husband who controlled every breath she took. When Officer Daniel found her and gently asked if she wanted to go home, her answer cut through him. "I'd rather give birth in the street than go back there." For years, she had hidden bruises and swallowed her voice, but this pregnancy gave her something she'd forgotten: courage. What Grace told Daniel next broke this seasoned officer completely. Her story of planning her escape for months, of choosing an uncertain future over guaranteed hell, of fearing her baby would know fear before love. Daniel's professional mask crumbled as tears ran down his face. But would her decision to flee save them both, or lead to consequences neither saw coming? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months earlier, Grace Martinez had been a different woman entirely. She moved through her days like a dancer following choreography she'd never chosen, each step measured to avoid shattering the carefully constructed silence of her home. The house on Maple Street looked perfect from the outside. White picket fence, rose bushes that Marcus tended obsessively, windows that sparkled because Grace spent hours meeting his standards. But houses, like people, can hide their secrets behind beautiful facades. Grace had learned to read Marcus like a barometer, sensing the pressure changes that preceded his storms. The way his jaw tightened when his coffee wasn't perfect, how his fingers drummed when dinner was late, the particular silence that filled the air when she forgot to arrange his newspapers in exact order. She had become an expert in the microscopic details that could determine whether her evening would pass in peace or end with her concealing new bruises beneath long sleeves. The morning she discovered she was pregnant, Grace stared at the pink lines that would change everything. Her first emotion wasn't joy. It was deep, aching sadness for the child who would grow up learning to read those same atmospheric pressures, who would inherit her careful footsteps and measured breaths. She hid the pregnancy test in a shoebox, beneath loose floorboards in their bedroom closet. Over the following weeks, that box became her secret sanctuary. Inside, she collected small scraps of hope: prenatal vitamins purchased with cash, a notebook where she recorded secret appointments, and phone numbers for shelters written in code only she understood. Dr. Sarah Chen had been Grace's lifeline during those early weeks. The kind obstetrician worked at the community clinic across town, far from where Marcus insisted Grace receive health care. Dr. Chen asked questions no one had asked Grace in years, about her emotional well-being, her support system, her fears. "You seem anxious," Dr. Chen observed during Grace's second secret appointment. "Is everything all right at home?" Grace had practiced her response. "Just normal first-time mother worries." But Dr. Chen's gentle eyes made Grace want to confess everything. Instead, she kept her secrets locked tight, even as her body began showing signs that would soon become impossible to hide. Mrs. Rodriguez, their elderly neighbor, had noticed things others missed. Maria Rodriguez had raised 6 children and buried a husband who drank too much and hit too often. She recognized the signs: the way Grace flinched at car doors slamming, how she positioned herself near exits, the careful movements that spoke of someone protecting hidden injuries. "Mija," Mrs. Rodriguez said one afternoon, "you know where I live if you ever need anything, day or night." Meanwhile, Officer Daniel Cruz lived his own quiet existence. At 36, he had 12 years with the police force, long enough to develop life-saving instincts and wisdom about when something wasn't right. His divorce had been finalized 2 years earlier, a marriage that ended in gentle recognition that two good people had grown in different directions. Daniel had particular sensitivity to domestic situations, maybe because his own mother had hidden bruises from his father, or maybe because he couldn't stand seeing power used against the powerless. His colleagues called him the knight in blue armor, but Daniel knew his intuition led him to people who needed help most. He worked early morning shifts, preferring quiet hours when the city was waking and people were most honest about their struggles. During these dawn patrols, he encountered individuals others might miss: homeless veterans, runaway teenagers, women who walked too carefully and looked over their shoulders too often. Grace's world was slowly closing in. Marcus monitored her more closely as spring arrived. He checked her car's mileage after every errand, counted money in her wallet with mathematical precision, installed a security system that tracked her movements from his phone. "You never know what dangerous people are out there," he would say, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder. By April, Grace was 12 weeks pregnant and running out of ways to hide the changes. Morning sickness she blamed on stress, fatigue, on poor sleep. But soon there would be visible evidence no excuse could explain. Grace began planning earnestly, her hidden notebook filled with researched information about shelters, protective orders, legal aid services. She accumulated small amounts of cash and began documenting everything, every incident, threat, moment when Marcus's control became violence. She photographed bruises with a disposable camera hidden in her car and recorded dates when he hurt her. Grace understood that leaving would require evidence, especially if she was taking a child. The pivotal moment came on a Thursday evening in late April. Grace was 20 weeks pregnant, just beginning to show despite loose clothing. She prepared dinner when Marcus arrived early, his mood already dark. "Why are you moving so strangely?" he asked, eyes narrowing. "I pulled a muscle in my back." Grace lied automatically, but Marcus was too observant to let inconsistencies pass. He studied her with prosecutorial intensity, and Grace felt her carefully constructed world cracking. That night, as Marcus slept, Grace retrieved her notebook and made a life-changing decision. She wrote a single date when she would leave. She gave herself 2 weeks for final preparations, to gather documentation, to find courage that had been building inside her like the child she carried. She didn't know she would need that courage much sooner, that Marcus's suspicions were growing, or that her pregnancy would become both her greatest vulnerability and ultimate source of strength. What Grace knew was that she could not raise a child where love was measured in silence and safety earned through submission. Her baby deserved better than a father who ruled through fear, and a mother who had forgotten how to speak without permission. For the first time in years, Grace fell asleep with something approaching peace. She had a plan and a reason to follow through. The life growing inside her had given her what years of pain had not, the determination to finally save herself. The end came on a Tuesday morning in early May, when Grace was 24 weeks pregnant and could no longer hide the gentle curve of her belly beneath loose sweaters. Marcus had left for work in his usual fashion, checking locks twice, kissing Grace goodbye with lips that felt like ownership, reminding her to call before leaving the house. Grace nodded and smiled, playing the perfected role. But this morning was different. This morning, Grace had forgotten to hide the prenatal vitamins. She discovered her mistake returning from her secret appointment with Dr. Chen, still overwhelmed by the ultrasound, revealing she was carrying a daughter. Grace had been so caught up in the surreal joy of seeing tiny hands and feet that she'd left the vitamin bottle on the bathroom counter next to her toothbrush. The bottle sat like evidence. At a crime scene, bright orange plastic with large letters that might as well have been a confession. Grace stared at it with the strange disconnect between disaster's magnitude and the moment's smallness. She considered throwing it away, claiming ignorance if Marcus found it in trash. She could say she'd been taking them for general health, though the label clearly marked them as prenatal supplements. She could run right now with nothing but $27 hidden in her jewelry box. Instead, Grace tried to control the situation perfectly. She took the bottle to the kitchen and placed it among her other vitamins, hoping it would blend in with calcium tablets and multivitamins Marcus had approved. But Marcus noticed things. especially things disrupting his perfect order. He came home that evening in good mood, bringing Chinese takeout and daisies that made her remember why she'd fallen in love with him. They ate dinner talking about his day and her afternoon of grocery shopping and cleaning. Grace began believing she might have escaped detection. Then Marcus went to get his evening medications. Grace heard the vitamin container open behind her, heard small plastic bottles rattle as he moved them around. She continued washing dishes, hands steady, despite adrenaline flooding her system when the rattling stopped. "Grace." His voice was quiet, controlled in the way preceding his worst episodes. "Come here." She dried her hands slowly, buying precious seconds. When she turned around, Marcus held the prenatal vitamins like a prosecutor presenting evidence. "What is this?" Grace's rehearsed words scattered like birds. "I've been having health issues. My doctor recommended them for—" "Don't lie to me." Marcus's voice remained quiet, but Grace saw jaw muscles tightening. "These are prenatal vitamins for pregnant women." The silence felt like standing at a cliff's edge. Grace understood her next words would determine not just this evening's trajectory, but possibly her life's rest. "I'm pregnant," she said simply. Marcus stared, his expression cycling through surprise, calculation, something like joy, before settling into cold anger she knew too well. "How long?" "Almost 6 months." 6 months. He repeated the words like testing their weight. "You've been pregnant for 6 months and didn't tell me." Grace watched his hands, always his hands. When Marcus prepared to hurt her, his fingers flexed unconsciously, like a pianist warming up. She saw the familiar movement beginning and stepped backward instinctively. "I was scared. I wasn't sure how you'd react." "You weren't sure how I'd react to finding out my wife is carrying my child." His voice rose, careful control cracking. "You weren't sure how the father would feel about becoming a father." "Marcus, please. Where have you been going for appointments? Because it wasn't Dr. Williams. I checked." Grace felt her world collapsing. Marcus had been monitoring her medical care without her knowledge, probably for months. The community, a clinic, Dr. Chen, her secret ultrasounds. None had been as hidden as she'd believed. "The community clinic on Riverside," she said. No point lying anymore. Marcus's face underwent transformation Grace had seen before, but never to this degree. The jaw muscle jumped once, twice, then his expression went completely blank. Dangerous. Calm preceding his worst violence. "You've been sneaking around behind my back for months, lying to me, making medical decisions without consulting me, spending our money on doctors I didn't approve." Each accusation delivered in flat tone, like reading grocery list items. "I was going to tell you." The first blow came so quickly, Grace couldn't protect herself. Marcus's open hand caught her face with enough force to snap her head sideways and send her stumbling against the kitchen counter. Precisely calculated, hard enough to hurt, not hard enough to leave obvious marks. "Don't lie to me," he shouted, control finally shattering. "Not about this!" Grace's hand went instinctively to her belly, protecting the child inside. The gesture was protective, maternal, and absolutely wrong in front of a man already feeling betrayed and excluded. Marcus saw the gesture, and his expression changed again, becoming something Grace had never seen. Cold rage encompassing not just her betrayal, but the very existence of the child she protected. "You think I don't know what you're doing? You think I can't see what this is really about?" He stepped toward her and Grace pressed against the counter, trying to become smaller, less threatening, invisible. "You planned this. You got pregnant to trap me, to make sure I couldn't leave you. And when that didn't work fast enough, you decided to keep it secret so you could control everything. That's not true, isn't it?" Marcus grabbed her wrist, fingers finding exact spots where old bruises had faded into yellow-green shadows. "You've been planning to leave me. Admit it." Grace's silence was answer enough. Marcus's grip tightened until she gasped in pain. "You are going to take my child and disappear, steal my baby and run away like some criminal. I would never keep your child from you." "Our child." His correction was sharp, possessive. "Our child, who you've been hiding from me for 6 months. Our child, who you were planning to use as a weapon against me." The accusation was so far from truth that Grace felt sudden anger stronger than fear. This pregnancy hadn't been a trap or weapon. It had been her salvation, the thing finally giving her courage to imagine life beyond his control. "I wasn't trying to trap you," she said, voice stronger than it had been in months. "I was trying to protect." Marcus's second blow caught her ribs, driving air from her lungs and sending pain shooting through her back and abdomen. This time there was no calculation, no careful force modulation. This time he hit her like he meant to hurt. Her and Grace understood with terrifying clarity that something fundamental had changed. She doubled over, gasping, arms wrapped around her belly in futile attempt to shield her daughter from violence, now directed not just at Grace, but at the child she carried. "Protect what?" Marcus demanded. "Protect our baby from its father, from the man who's going to love and provide for it for the rest of its life?" Grace couldn't answer. She was too focused on sharp abdominal pain, terrible fear that Marcus's blow had hurt more than just her. For several terrifying seconds, she waited for telltale signs something was wrong. Bleeding, cramping, absence of movement she'd grown accustomed to feeling. When her daughter shifted and kicked, responding to trauma, Grace nearly cried with relief. Marcus was still talking, voice a steady stream of accusations Grace barely heard. She was calculating distances, garage door, car keys, time to reach, her vehicle and drive away. But her purse was upstairs, important documents hidden throughout the house, and she had nowhere to go. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." Grace straightened slowly, hands still pressed protectively against her belly. Marcus's face was flushed with anger, but underneath rage she could see something like hurt, wounded pride of a man believing he'd been betrayed by the person he trusted most. "This is my child too," he said, voice regaining some control. "My child, who I have every right to know about, to make decisions for, to protect. You don't get to cut me out. You don't get to make those choices alone." "You're right," Grace said quietly. "I should have told you. You should have done a lot of things differently." Marcus walked to the counter and picked up his keys, wallet, phone, items he always gathered when preparing to leave. Grace watched this routine with the same attention she'd once paid to his moods, trying to understand what came next. "I'm going out," he announced. "When I come back, we're going to have a long conversation about how things will change around here, about rules we'll need for raising our child, about the kind of mother you're going to be." Grace nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "And Grace?" Marcus paused at the kitchen doorway. "If you're not here when I get back, I will find you, and when I do, you'll wish you had never tried to keep my child from me." The front door slammed with enough force to rattle windows. Grace stood listening to his car start, listening to tire sounds on the driveway, listening to silence following his departure. Then she ran upstairs and began to pack. Illity. Grace drove through the night with no destination in mind, just the urgent need to put distance between herself and the man who had finally shown her exactly how dangerous he could be. She stopped twice, once for gas, once to use a restroom at an all-night diner, but mostly she just drove, listening to her daughter move restlessly inside her, as if the baby could sense her mother's fear. As dawn approached, Grace found herself in Riverside Park, the same park where she had brought lunch during her secret appointments at the nearby clinic. She parked her car and walked to a bench that overlooked the playground, empty now in the early morning light. This was where Officer Daniel Cruz would find her 3 hours later, sitting barefoot and exhausted, but somehow more peaceful than she had felt in years. For the first time since her marriage began, Grace had chosen her own safety over Marcus's. Comfort. She had protected her daughter over protecting his feelings. She had finally, after years of silence, found her voice loud enough to say no. The morning sun found Grace exactly where she had settled 3 hours earlier, her body curved protectively around her unborn daughter as she dozed fitfully on the park bench. The May air was cool enough to raise goosebumps, but she barely noticed. For the first time in years, the chill had nothing to do with fear. Officer Daniel Cruz had been patrolling the same route for 6 months, long enough to know which corners attracted trouble at dawn and which parks drew people seeking solitude in their darkest hours. Riverside Park wasn't typically part of his routine, but something had pulled him there, the same instinct that had kept him alive through 12 years of police work. He saw Grace from 50 yards away, a small figure hunched on a bench facing the empty playground. Something about her posture triggered his protective instincts. The way she held herself spoke of someone trying to take up as little space as possible in the world. Daniel parked his patrol car and approached slowly, making sure his footsteps were audible. "Good morning," he said when he was still several feet away. "I'm Officer Cruz. Are you all right?" Grace looked up with eyes that seemed too old for her face, taking in his uniform, his badge, the genuine concern in his expression. She had been preparing for this moment since leaving Marcus's house. "I'm fine," she said automatically, the response programmed by years of hiding truth. Daniel had heard that particular tone of fine hundreds of times. It was the fine that meant anything but, carrying the weight of untold stories and careful secrets. He noted how she positioned her hands protectively over her belly, the faded bruise along her jawline, the exhaustion that went deeper than a sleepless night. "Mind if I sit down?" he asked, gesturing to the other end of the bench. Grace nodded, scooting over to make room. She was surprised by his gentleness, by the way he seemed to understand she needed space and time rather than immediate answers. Daniel settled onto the bench and looked out at the playground, giving Grace opportunity to study him without pressure. She saw a man in his mid-30s with kind eyes and careful movements, someone comfortable with silence. "Beautiful morning," he observed, though the sun was still pale. "I always like this park. It feels peaceful." "Yes," Grace agreed, surprised to find herself talking. "It does. I'm guessing you didn't plan to spend the night here." It wasn't quite a question, more an observation that left room for Grace to decide how much to reveal. "No," she said quietly. "I just needed somewhere to think." Daniel nodded, understanding that sometimes people needed to think in places that felt safe, even if those places were park benches at dawn. He noticed she wasn't wearing shoes, that her clothes looked hastily chosen, that she kept glancing at the parking lot as if expecting someone. "Are you hurt?" he asked gently. Grace's hand went automatically to her ribs, where Marcus's blow had left deep ache. Not exactly. Not exactly usually means yes, but it's complicated. The accuracy made Grace look at him more carefully. She saw something in his expression that reminded her of Dr. Chen, professional compassion that seemed genuine rather than practiced. "I left my husband," she said, words rushing out before she could stop them. "Last night. I just couldn't stay anymore." Daniel felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came with domestic situations. He had learned to manage personal reactions carefully, to remain professional while acknowledging the courage it took to reach the point where leaving felt safer than staying. That must have been a difficult decision. "The most difficult thing I've ever done," Grace admitted. "But I'm pregnant and I couldn't—" She stopped, realizing she was telling this stranger things she had never spoken aloud. "I'm sorry, you don't need to hear about my problems. Actually, helping people through problems is exactly what I signed up for," Daniel said. "And sometimes talking to someone not involved in the situation can help you figure out what you need to do next." Grace studied his face, looking for signs of judgment or impatience. Instead, she found only patient attention, as if he had all the time in the world. "He's not a bad person," she began, then stopped herself. The words felt false. "Actually, that's not true. He is a bad person, at least to me. He controls everything. Where I go, who I talk to, what I eat, when I sleep. And last night, he found out about the pregnancy and he—" Grace's voice caught, remembering the look in Marcus's eyes when he realized she had been keeping secrets. "Did he hurt you?" Daniel asked quietly. "Yes." The admission came out as barely, more than a whisper. Not just last night, for a long time, but last night was different. Last night he looked at me like he wanted to—" She stopped, unable to finish. "Like he wanted to hurt more than just you." Grace nodded, tears starting to flow for the first time since fleeing her house. "I was so scared he was going to hurt the baby. I've been planning to leave for months, but last night I knew I couldn't wait anymore." Daniel reached into his car and retrieved water and tissues, offering both without comment. Grace accepted them gratefully, taking small sips while trying to calm her breathing. "Have you been to a doctor about the pregnancy?" he asked. "Yes, Dr. Chen at the community clinic. She's been wonderful, but I had to keep the appointment secret. Marcus doesn't know about her." "How far along are you?" "Almost 6 months. It's a girl." Grace's voice softened when she spoke about her daughter. "Do you have somewhere to go?" "Family, friends?" Grace shook her head. "Marcus isolated me from most of my friends over the years. My family lives in another state, and they've always thought he was wonderful. I'm not sure they'd believe me if I told them the truth." Daniel had seen this pattern too many times. Abusers who presented charming facades while systematically destroying their victims' support networks. "What about shelters? Have you looked into any resources available for women in your situation?" "I've researched them," Grace said. "I have phone numbers and addresses. I just wasn't sure. I have money saved, and I don't want to take a space someone else might need more." "Grace," Daniel said, using her name for the first time, "someone who is sitting barefoot in a park at dawn because she was afraid to stay in her own home absolutely qualifies for shelter services. That's exactly what they exist for." The validation felt like a gift Grace hadn't known she needed. For so long, Marcus had convinced her that her fears were exaggerated, that other women had it much worse. Hearing a police officer confirm that her situation was serious enough to warrant professional help began to untangle some of the self-doubt that had kept her trapped. "Would you like me to make some calls?" Daniel offered. "I know people who run several local shelters. I could help you get connected with someone who can walk you through your options." "You would do that?" "It's part of my job," Daniel said simply, "and honestly, it's the part of my job I care about most." Grace looked at this stranger offering to help rebuild her life, and for the first time since discovering those prenatal vitamins on her bathroom counter, she felt something approaching hope. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." For the first time since she had fled her house. "I was so scared he was going to hurt the baby. I've been planning to leave for months, but last night I knew I couldn't wait anymore." Daniel reached into his patrol car and retrieved a bottle of water and a small package of tissues, offering both to Grace without comment. She accepted them gratefully, taking small sips while trying to calm her breathing. "Have you been to a doctor about the pregnancy?" he asked. "Yes, Dr. Chen at the community clinic. She's been wonderful, but I had to keep the appointment secret." "Marcus doesn't know about her. How far along are you?" "Almost 6 months. It's a girl." Grace's voice softened when she spoke about her daughter, and Daniel could see the protective love that had given her the strength to leave everything familiar behind. "Do you have somewhere to go? Family, friends?" Grace shook her head. "Marcus isolated me from most of my friends over the years. My family lives in another state, and they've always thought he was wonderful. I'm not sure they'd believe me if I told them the truth." Daniel had seen this pattern too many times. Abusers who presented charming facades to the outside world while systematically destroying their victims' support networks. It was one of the reasons domestic violence situations were so difficult to escape and so dangerous when victims finally tried to leave. "What about shelters? Have you looked into any of the resources available for women in your situation?" "I've researched them," Grace said. "I have phone numbers and addresses. I just wasn't sure. I have money saved, and I don't want to take a space that someone else might need more." "Grace," Daniel said, using her name for the first time, "someone who is sitting barefoot in a park at dawn because she was afraid to stay in her own home absolutely qualifies for shelter services. That's exactly what they exist for." The validation felt like a gift Grace hadn't known she needed. For so long, Marcus had convinced her that her fears were exaggerated, that her reactions were disproportionate, that other women had it much worse. Hearing a police officer confirm that her situation was serious enough to warrant professional help began to untangle some of the self-doubt that had kept her trapped for so long. "Would you like me to make some calls?" Daniel offered. "I know the people who run several of the local shelters. I could help you get connected with someone who can walk you through your options." "You would do that?" "It's part of my job," Daniel said simply. "And honestly, it's the part of my job I care about most." Grace looked at this stranger who was offering to help rebuild her life, and for the first time since she had discovered those prenatal vitamins on her bathroom counter, she felt something approaching hope. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." Daniel pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for Haven House, the women's shelter that had the best reputation for supporting pregnant women and new mothers. As he waited for someone to answer, he glanced at Grace and saw her looking back toward the parking lot again. "He doesn't know where you are," Daniel said reassuringly. "You're safe right now." "How can you be sure?" "Because if he knew where you were, he would already be here. Men like your husband don't wait patiently when they feel like they're losing control." The observation was both comforting and terrifying. Grace realized that her safety depended entirely on staying hidden, on making sure Marcus never discovered where she had gone or who was helping her. "Hello, Maria," Daniel said into his phone. "This is Officer Cruz. I have a woman here who needs immediate shelter placement. She's pregnant and fleeing domestic violence." He paused, listening. "Yes, I'll bring her right over." He ended the call and turned back to Grace. "They have space for you, and they're expecting us within the hour. Are you ready to take the next step?" Grace looked around the park one more time, at the bench that had sheltered her through the longest night of her life, at the playground where she imagined her daughter might someday play safely. Then she looked at Officer Daniel Cruz, this unexpected guardian who had appeared exactly when she needed him most. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. Haven House sat on a quiet residential street, its exterior deliberately unremarkable. The discretion was intentional. Women fleeing dangerous situations needed sanctuary that wouldn't advertise their presence. Maria Santos greeted Grace and Daniel at the front door with practiced warmth. At 52, Maria had run Haven House for 8 years, long enough to recognize the exhaustion that came from escaping immediate danger. "Grace," Maria said, "I'm so glad you found your way here." The intake process was gentle. Maria led her to a small office decorated with soft colors and comfortable furniture. She offered Grace tea and breakfast, understanding that people in crisis often forgot basic needs. "This form is just basic information," Maria explained. "Nothing shared without your permission. We take confidentiality very seriously." Grace stared at the intake form, the first official documentation of her decision to leave Marcus. Under reason for seeking shelter, she wrote, "Domestic violence." The words looked stark on paper, but also liberating. For the first time in years, Grace was officially acknowledging the truth. "How far along is your pregnancy?" Maria asked. 24 weeks. "I'm having a girl." "That's wonderful. We have several other mothers here. You'll find this is a supportive community." Maria's smile was genuine. "Have you been receiving prenatal care?" "Yes, at the community clinic with Dr. Chen. But I had to keep the appointment secret." Maria nodded knowingly. "Dr. Chen works closely with us. We can arrange for you to continue seeing her. I need to ask about immediate safety concerns. Do you believe your husband knows where you are?" "No, I don't." "Think so. Has he tried to contact you this morning?" Grace realized she hadn't checked her phone. She pulled it from her backpack and saw 17 missed calls from Marcus, along with text messages that escalated from pleading to threatening. "Grace, please come home. We can work this out. Where are you?" "I'm worried sick. This is ridiculous." "Come home now! You can't take my child away from me. I won't let you." Maria read the messages, her expression growing serious. This is exactly the escalation pattern we see. We need to document this and get you connected with legal advocacy immediately. Daniel joined them. Any contact from your husband? Grace showed him the messages. This threatening language about not letting you take his child, that's helpful. Evidence for a protective order, Daniel said. But you should turn off your phone. He might be able to track your location through it. Grace turned off her phone with shaking hands, feeling like she was severing her connection to the outside world. We have a house phone you can use, Maria assured her, and we can help you set up a new phone line. Over the next hour, Grace met the other residents. Carmen, 19 and 7 months pregnant, had fled after her boyfriend pushed her down. Stairs. Lisa, 28, had 2 children and was working with legal aid to divorce her husband. Sandra, 35, was preparing to move into transitional housing. Each woman's story was different, but Grace recognized common threads: the gradual isolation, the escalating control, the moment when staying became more dangerous than leaving. The hardest part, Sandra told Grace over lunch, is learning to trust your own judgment again. When someone spends years telling you that your perceptions are wrong, it takes time to believe in yourself. That afternoon, Grace met with Dr. James. Right, the shelter's counselor. Everything you're feeling right now is completely normal, he told Grace. Guilt, fear, relief, anger, sometimes all at the same time. Leaving an abusive relationship is one of the most difficult things a person can do. I don't feel courageous, Grace admitted. I feel terrified and guilty. That's exactly what I mean about normal reactions, Dr. Wright said gently. Your husband spent years training you to believe his needs were more important than your safety. It's going to take time to unlearn those patterns. Meanwhile, Marcus had called the police to report Grace missing, presenting himself as a distraught husband. The responding officers took his report seriously until Daniel provided additional context about the domestic violence situation. Back at Haven House, Detective Lisa Reeves arrived to help Grace understand her legal options. The text messages he sent are evidence of stalking and threatening behavior, Detective Reeves explained. Combined with your testimony about physical abuse, we have grounds for criminal charges and a protective order. What if he denies everything? Grace asked. That's why documentation is important. Do you have any photographs of injuries, medical records, or other evidence? Grace thought of the notebook hidden beneath her floorboards, the disposable camera in her car. Yes, some is still at the house, but I have documentation. We'll work on getting a warrant to retrieve your belongings safely, Detective Reeves said. As evening approached, Grace settled into her small but comfortable room. The bed was narrow but clean, and for the first time in months, she could lock her door from the inside. She lay in the darkness, listening to other women and children, settling in for the night. Despite everything, the uncertainty, the fear, the guilt, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the peace that comes from being somewhere safe. Her daughter moved inside her, a gentle reminder of why she had found the courage to leave. Grace placed her hand on her belly and whispered, "We're going to be okay, little one." For the first time in 4 years, she believed it might actually be true. Yes, at the community clinic with Dr. Chen, but I had to keep the appointment secret from my husband. Maria nodded knowingly. Dr. Chen is excellent, and she works closely with us when residents need continued care. We can arrange for you to continue seeing her, and we have transportation available for medical appointments. The relief Grace felt was overwhelming. In one morning, she had gone from having no support system to being surrounded by people whose job was to help her rebuild her life safely. Now, Maria continued, I need to ask about immediate safety concerns. Do you believe your husband knows where you are right now? No, at least I don't think so. I didn't tell anyone where I was going because I didn't know myself. Has he tried to contact you this morning? Grace realized she hadn't checked her phone since leaving the house. She pulled it from her backpack and saw 17 missed calls from Marcus, along with a series of text messages that started pleading and quickly escalated to threatening. Grace, Please come home. We can work this out. Where are you? I'm worried. Sick. This is ridiculous. Come home now. If you don't answer your phone in the next hour, I'm calling the police to report you missing. You can't take my child away from me. I won't let you. Maria read the messages over Grace's shoulder, her expression growing more serious. This is exactly the escalation pattern we see. He's moving from manipulation to threats. We need to document all of this and get you connected. With legal advocacy immediately. Legal advocacy? A restraining order for starters. And if he follows through on his threat to report you missing, we need to make sure law enforcement understands the real situation. Officer Cruz can help with that. Daniel, who had been waiting patiently in the lobby, joined them in the office. Any contact from your husband? Grace showed him the messages, watching his expression harden as he read Marcus's increasingly aggressive texts. This threatening language about not letting you take his child, that's going to be helpful evidence. For a protective order, Daniel said. But you should probably turn off your phone for now. If it's not an older model, he might be able to track your location through it. Grace felt her tenuous sense of security wobble. She hadn't considered that Marcus might be able to use technology to find her. How could he do that? There are several ways, Maria explained. Shared phone plans often include location tracking features. Some people install monitoring software on their partner's devices without them knowing. The safest thing is to assume he has access to your phone's location and act accordingly. Grace turned off her phone with shaking hands, feeling like she was severing her last connection to the outside world. The silence that followed felt both protective and isolating. We have a house phone you can use for important calls, Maria assured her, and we can help you set up a new phone line that he won't have access to. Over the next hour, Grace was introduced to the other residents of Haven House. There was Carmen, 19 and 7 months pregnant, who had fled her boyfriend's apartment after he pushed her down a flight of stairs. Lisa, 28, had 2 young children and was working with legal aid to divorce her husband while staying hidden from him. Sandra, 35, had been at the shelter for 3 months and was preparing to move into transitional housing. Each woman's story was different, but Grace recognized the common threads, the gradual isolation, the escalating control, the moment when staying became more dangerous than leaving. For the first time in years, she was surrounded by people who understood exactly what she had experienced without requiring explanation or justification. The hardest part, Sandra told Grace over lunch, is learning to trust your own judgment. Again, when someone spends years telling you that your perceptions are wrong, it takes time to believe in yourself again. That afternoon, Grace met with Dr. James Wright, the shelter's counselor. Dr. Wright was a soft-spoken man in his 50s who specialized in trauma recovery and had worked with domestic violence survivors for over 2 decades. I want you to know that everything you're feeling right now is completely normal, he told Grace during their first session. Guilt, fear, relief, anger, sometimes all at the same time. Leaving an abusive relationship is one of the most difficult things a person can do. And you should be proud of your courage. I don't feel courageous, Grace admitted. I feel terrified and guilty and like I've made a terrible mistake. That's exactly what I mean about normal reactions, Dr. Wright said gently. Your husband spent years training you to believe that his needs and feelings were more important than your safety. It's going to take time to unlearn those patterns. Grace found herself talking about things she had never spoken aloud. The way Marcus monitored her phone calls, how he timed her errands and questioned discrepancies, the way he made her feel responsible for his moods and reactions. As she spoke, Dr. Wright helped her identify the patterns of psychological abuse that had been so subtle she hadn't recognized them as abuse at all. Physical violence gets more attention, Dr. Wright explained, but the psychological control is often what keeps people trapped. When someone systematically undermines your confidence and isolates you from support, leaving feels impossible, even when staying is dangerous. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus was making good on his threats. He had called the police to report Grace missing, presenting himself as a distraught husband whose pregnant wife had disappeared without explanation. The responding officers took his report seriously until Daniel Cruz learned about the call and provided additional context. "We have reason to believe this is a domestic violence situation," Daniel told his sergeant. "The woman is safe, but she's fleeing abuse. The husband's missing person report is likely an attempt to use law enforcement to track her down." The conversation that followed highlighted one of the challenges Grace would face: Marcus's ability to manipulate systems and people who didn't understand the dynamics of domestic abuse. He was charming, articulate, and genuinely seemed like a concerned husband to people who only saw his public face. Back at Haven House, Grace was learning about the legal protections available to her. Detective Lisa Reeves, Daniel's partner, arrived in the early evening to help Grace understand her options for pursuing criminal charges and obtaining a restraining order. "The text messages he sent this morning are evidence of stalking and threatening behavior," Detective Reeves explained. "Combined with your testimony about the physical abuse, we have grounds for both criminal charges and a protective order." "What if he denies everything?" Grace asked. "That's why documentation is so important. Do you have any photographs of injuries, medical records, or other evidence of the abuse?" Grace thought of the notebook hidden beneath her floorboards, the disposable camera in her car's spare tire well, the careful record she had kept for months. "Yes, some of it is still at the house, but I have documentation. We'll work on getting a warrant to retrieve your belongings safely," Detective Reeves said. "In the meantime, I want you to write down everything you can remember about incidents of abuse, dates, details, witnesses if there were any." As evening approached, Grace settled into the small but comfortable room that would be her home for the foreseeable future. The bed was narrow but clean, the window looked out onto a small garden, and for the first time in months she could lock her door from the inside. She lay in the darkness listening to the sounds of other women and children settling in for the night, and despite everything, the uncertainty, the fear, the guilt, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the peace that comes from being somewhere safe. Her daughter moved inside her, a gentle reminder of why she had found the courage to leave everything familiar behind. Grace placed her hand on her belly and whispered, "We're going to be okay, little one. We're going to be okay." For the first time in 4 years, she believed it might actually be true. Marcus Martinez had always been a methodical man, and his search for Grace reflected the same systematic approach he brought to everything else in his life. By Thursday morning, 48 hours after Grace's disappearance, he had transformed their home into a command center focused on one objective: bringing his wife back under his control. The dining room table was covered with printouts, maps of the city, marked with shelters and clinics, phone records he had obtained by calling their cellular provider and claiming Grace had lost her phone, bank statements showing every transaction she had made in the past 6 months. Marcus studied these documents with the intensity of a detective, looking for patterns that might reveal where Grace had gone and who was helping her. He had called in sick to work, something he had never done in 7 years at the insurance office. His supervisor expressed concern about the family emergency Marcus claimed, offering support and flexibility. Everyone at Marcus's office saw him as a dedicated family man, someone who spoke lovingly about his wife and was excited about becoming a father. The idea that Grace might be fleeing from him rather than missing against her will seemed impossible to people who only knew his public persona. Marcus's first stop had been Grace's sister Emma, who lived across town with her husband and 2 young children. Marcus had always cultivated a good relationship with Grace's family, presenting himself as the stable, successful man who had rescued Grace from a series of bad relationships and given her the security she craved. "I'm so worried about her," Marcus told Emma, his voice breaking in exactly the right places. She's been struggling with the pregnancy, mood swings, depression, paranoia. Yesterday, she just disappeared. I'm terrified something has happened to her and the baby." Emma had been genuinely alarmed. Grace hadn't contacted her family in several months, which wasn't unusual given how busy Marcus kept her with household responsibilities. But the idea that Grace might be wandering around the city in a confused or dangerous mental state sparked immediate panic. "Have you checked the hospitals?" Emma asked. "That was my first thought, but there's no record of her being admitted anywhere. The police think she might have left voluntarily, but that doesn't make sense. Grace would never put our baby at risk like that." Marcus's performance was flawless, the concerned husband dealing with a wife's mental health crisis. He showed Emma the text messages Grace had sent from the shelter's phone the previous evening, messages that simply said she was safe and needed time to think. "See how erratic this sounds?" Marcus pointed out. "This isn't like Grace. She's never been impulsive or dramatic. I think the pregnancy hormones combined with her anxiety might have triggered some kind of breakdown." Emma studied the messages, trying to reconcile them with her memory of her sister. Grace had always been the steady one, the sister who thought things through carefully and never acted on impulse. The idea that she would suddenly abandon her home and husband did seem out of character. "Maybe I should call her," Emma suggested. "The police tried that. She's not answering calls from numbers she recognizes. I think she's too confused or scared to trust anyone right now." Marcus left Emma's house with a promise that she would call immediately if Grace contacted her. He had also planted seeds of doubt about Grace's mental state that would grow in Emma's mind over the coming days, making her more likely to support his version of events if Grace eventually reached out for help. His next stop was Dr. Williams, the family physician Marcus had chosen for Grace's general health care. Marcus had specifically avoided the community clinic where Grace had been receiving prenatal care, since he wasn't supposed to know about those appointments. "I'm concerned about my wife's mental state during this pregnancy," Marcus told Dr. Williams during an impromptu consultation. "She's been exhibiting paranoid behavior, mood swings, and yesterday she disappeared completely. Is it possible that pregnancy could trigger some kind of psychological episode?" Dr. Williams, who had known Grace for 3 years as a quiet, compliant, patient, was surprised by Marcus's description. "Grace has always seemed very stable during her appointments. Has she mentioned feeling depressed or anxious?" "She tries to hide it from medical professionals," Marcus explained. "She's always been embarrassed about emotional problems. But at home, she's been increasingly erratic, forgetting conversations we've had, accusing me of things that never happened, becoming suspicious of our neighbors and friends." Marcus's description painted a picture of a woman struggling with pregnancy-related mental health issues, a scenario that, while concerning, was not uncommon enough to raise immediate red flags. Dr. Williams made notes in Grace's file and suggested that Marcus encourage her to seek counseling when she returned home. "I'm planning to do exactly that," Marcus assured him, "if I can just find her first." The most challenging part of Marcus's search was navigating the network of women's shelters and domestic violence resources in the city. These organizations were specifically designed to keep their clients hidden from abusive partners, and Marcus understood that approaching them directly would be counterproductive. Instead, he took a more subtle approach. Marcus contacted several shelters, claiming to be a concerned family member, trying to locate his sister, who he believed might be in an abusive relationship. He varied his story slightly with each call. Sometimes he was a brother, sometimes a cousin, sometimes a family friend. His goal wasn't to get them to admit Grace was there, but to gather information about their protocols and security measures. Through these calls, Marcus learned that most shelters had strict confidentiality policies, that they typically moved residents if they suspected they had been discovered, and that they worked closely with law enforcement when residents were in immediate danger. This information helped him understand that finding Grace would require patience and strategy rather than brute force. Marcus also began monitoring Grace's digital footprint with the obsessiveness that had characterized his control throughout their marriage. He checked her email accounts daily, looking for confirmations of appointments or communications with support services. He tracked the location history on her phone until she turned it off, giving him her last known location at Riverside Park. Before the trail went cold, most importantly, Marcus began building a public narrative that would serve his interests if Grace tried to seek legal protection or divorce him. He started documenting what he claimed was Grace's erratic behavior, creating a timeline of incidents that painted her as mentally unstable and potentially dangerous to their unborn child. Marcus called Grace's few remaining friends, expressing concern about her mental state and asking them to contact him immediately if Grace reached out. He visited their neighbors, explaining that Grace was missing and might be experiencing pregnancy-related psychological problems. Each conversation was carefully designed to establish a pattern of concern for Grace's welfare while subtly undermining her credibility. Mrs. Rodriguez, their elderly neighbor, who had always seemed suspicious of Marcus, was less receptive to his appeals for help. "That girl never seemed unstable to me," she told Marcus when he knocked on her door Thursday evening. "Quiet, maybe. Careful, but not crazy. The signs aren't always obvious," Marcus replied smoothly. "Grace has always been good at hiding her problems from other people. She doesn't like to worry anyone." Mrs. Rodriguez said, her eyes studying Marcus with uncomfortable intensity. "Well, if she shows up here, I'll certainly make sure she gets the help she needs." Something in the old woman's tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by Marcus's performance, but he couldn't afford to worry about one skeptical neighbor when he had larger concerns. By Thursday night, Marcus had systematically contacted everyone in Grace's limited social circle, visited the places she was known to frequent, and begun building a legal case for why Grace should be considered a danger to herself and their unborn child. He had also started researching private investigators who specialized in locating missing persons, understanding that his own efforts might not be sufficient to find Grace if she was being hidden by professionals. Most concerning for Grace's safety, Marcus had begun to understand that his wife's disappearance was not a spontaneous act of mental instability, but a carefully planned escape. The discovery that Grace had been hiding money and documents suggested premeditation that made him feel betrayed and furious in ways that went beyond his usual need for control. Marcus stood in their bedroom that night, staring at the loose floorboards, where Grace had hidden her notebook. The empty space underneath felt like an accusation, evidence of how thoroughly Grace had deceived him while living under his protection and care. "You think you're so clever," he said aloud to the empty room, "but you can't hide forever, and when I find you, you're going to learn what happens to wives who try to steal their husbands' children." Marcus's reflection in the bedroom mirror showed a man whose careful facade was beginning to crack under the pressure of losing control. The charming smile that had fooled Grace's family and friends was nowhere to be seen, replaced by the cold determination of someone who viewed his wife's escape as a theft of his property. He had already decided that when he found Grace, the consequences would be severe enough to ensure she never tried to leave again. The baby she was carrying wasn't just his child. It was the perfect tool to guarantee Grace's compliance for the rest of her life. Marcus turned off the bedroom light and began planning his next moves, unaware that across town Grace was sleeping, peacefully for the first time in years, protected by people who understood exactly what kind of man she was hiding from. The quilt hanging in Haven House's common room told a story that only its creators could fully understand. Each square had been sewn by a different resident over the years, some depicting flowers or peaceful landscapes, others showing broken chains or butterflies emerging from cocoons. Grace had been drawn to the quilt from her first day at the shelter, but it wasn't until her second week that Sandra explained its significance. "Every woman who stays here long enough adds a square," Sandra told Grace as they sat together in the evening, working on small crafts that helped keep their hands busy and their minds focused on creating rather than surviving. "It's not required, but most of us want to leave something behind for the women who come after us." Grace studied the squares more carefully, seeing the stories within the stories. A square showing a house with boarded windows, another depicting hands reaching toward light, a child's drawing of a family where everyone was smiling. Each piece represented not just artistic expression, but a woman's journey from danger to safety, from isolation to community. "What would you put on your square?" Sandra asked. Grace thought about it, her hand unconsciously moving to her belly, where her daughter continued to grow stronger each day. "Maybe footprints," she said finally. "Bare footprints leading away from something dark and toward something bright." "That's beautiful," Carmen said, joining their conversation. At 19, Carmen was the youngest resident, but her experiences had aged her beyond her years. "I've been thinking about mine too. Maybe a phoenix, something about rising from ashes." The conversations at Haven House were unlike anything Grace had experienced during her marriage. Women here spoke honestly about their fears, their hopes, their regrets, and their dreams. There was no need to hide bruises or make excuses for strange behaviors. Everyone understood the hypervigilance that made them check locks multiple times. Each night, the startled response that came with unexpected sounds, the way they positioned themselves near exits, even in safe spaces. Dr. Wright had explained this phenomenon during one of Grace's counseling sessions. "Trauma changes how our brains process safety and danger," he said. "Your nervous system has been in survival mode for so long that it takes time to learn how to relax again. These responses don't mean you're broken, they mean you're human." Grace found comfort in the routine of shelter life. Breakfast at 7, morning meditation at 8, group counseling at 10. The structure provided something she hadn't realized she was missing: predictability without punishment, routine without fear. If she was 5 minutes late to a meal, no one questioned her motives or threatened consequences. If she needed to skip an activity because she wasn't feeling well, her decisions were respected rather than interrogated. Meanwhile, Officer Daniel Cruz was facing his own challenges. His supervisor, Sergeant Matthews, had called him into the office to discuss what Matthews viewed as Daniel's excessive involvement in Grace's case. "I understand you want to help this woman," Sergeant Matthews said, "but you're spending a lot of time on what amounts to a domestic dispute that's already been resolved. She's safe, she's in a shelter, and protective services are handling her case. We have actual crimes to investigate." "This is an actual crime," Daniel replied. "Domestic violence is a crime. Stalking is a crime. The threatening messages her husband sent constitute harassment, and Detective Reeves is handling that investigation. Your job is patrol, not social work." Daniel had heard variations of this conversation throughout his career. Law enforcement agencies often struggled with the time and resources required for domestic violence cases, especially when victims were reluctant to prosecute or when abusers were skilled at avoiding obvious criminal behavior. "I'm not doing social work," Daniel said carefully. "I'm doing follow-up on a case that started on my patrol. If Grace's husband escalates his behavior, she's going to need immediate protection, and I'm familiar with the situation." Sergeant Matthews studied Daniel with the expression of someone who had seen too many good officers burn out from getting emotionally invested in cases they couldn't control. "Just make sure your personal feelings about this woman's situation. Don't compromise your professional judgment." The warning was clear, but Daniel had no intention of backing away from Grace's case. He had seen too many domestic violence situations end tragically when victims were left to navigate dangerous circumstances without adequate support. That afternoon, Daniel received news that validated his concerns. Detective Reeves had discovered that Marcus was actively trying to locate Grace through increasingly sophisticated means. Marcus had hired a private investigator, filed missing person reports in neighboring counties, and begun pressuring Grace's family members for information about her whereabouts. He's also been calling local hospitals, claiming that Grace has medical conditions that require immediate treatment, Detective Reeves told Daniel. He's trying to get them to confirm whether she's been admitted or received care anywhere. Has he been successful? Not so far. Hyper-protections are keeping most medical professionals from sharing information with him, but he's persistent, and he's getting more creative with his approaches. The escalation concerned everyone involved in Grace's case. Maria Santos had seen this pattern before. Abusers who refused to accept their victims' decisions to leave often became more dangerous as their initial search efforts failed. We might need to consider moving Grace to another facility, Maria told the team during their weekly case review meeting. If Marcus is hiring professional help to find her, Haven House might not be secure enough long-term. Dr. Chen had joined the meeting via phone to provide medical updates on Grace's pregnancy. She's doing well physically, Dr. Chen reported. The stress of her situation hasn't negatively impacted the baby's development so far. But we're approaching the third trimester, and I'm concerned about what might happen if her husband's harassment escalates closer to her due date. What specific concerns do you have? Maria asked. Stress-induced early labor primarily, and if Grace feels like she's constantly in danger, it could interfere with her ability to bond with the baby after delivery. Women in her situation sometimes struggle with postpartum depression at higher rates. Grace was not present for this meeting, but she was experiencing her own version of the same concerns. The safety of Haven House had allowed her to focus on her pregnancy in ways she hadn't been able to do while living with Marcus. She talked to her daughter throughout the day, sang to her, read children's books aloud. But Grace also worried about what kind of life she could provide as a single mother with limited resources and a dangerous ex-husband who wouldn't accept their separation. These worries had prompted Grace to reach out to her sister Emma for the first time since leaving Marcus. The conversation, conducted on Haven House's secure phone line, had not gone as Grace had hoped. "Marcus is worried sick about you," Emma said immediately. "He thinks you might be having some kind of breakdown. Are you taking care of yourself? Are you eating properly?" "I'm fine, Emma. I'm safe and the baby is healthy. I just needed to get away from Marcus. Get away from him." "Grace, what are you talking about? Marcus loves you. He's been calling everyone we know, trying to find you. He even contacted Mom and Dad." Grace felt her heart sink. She had hoped her family might understand her decision to leave, might ask the right questions about why she felt she needed to escape. Instead, Emma seemed to have accepted Marcus's version of events completely. "Did Marcus tell you why I left?" "He said you've been having mood swings and paranoid thoughts. He's worried. The pregnancy is affecting your mental health." "Emma, I left because Marcus has been hurting me for years. He controls everything I do, everywhere I go, everyone I talk to. When he found out about the pregnancy, he became violent in ways that scared me for the baby's safety." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Grace wondered if the call had been disconnected. "Grace," Emma said finally, "that doesn't sound like the Marcus I know. He's always been so good to you, so protective. Are you sure you're thinking clearly right now?" The question hit Grace like a physical blow. This was exactly what Marcus had trained her to expect, that even her own family would question her perceptions rather than believe her experiences. "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years," Grace said quietly. "I understand this is hard to believe, but I need you to trust me. I wouldn't have left everything behind if I wasn't in real danger." "Where are you staying? Let me come see you. We can talk about this in person." Grace recognized the tone in her sister's voice, the careful, soothing approach people used when they thought they were dealing with someone who wasn't entirely rational. "I can't tell you where I am. It's not safe." Not safe? Grace, you're scaring me. This really sounds like you might need professional help. The conversation ended with Emma promising to keep Grace's call confidential, but also expressing her intention to encourage Grace to come home and get counseling. Grace hung up, feeling more isolated than ever, understanding that Marcus's campaign to discredit her was already succeeding with her own family. That evening, as Grace worked on her square for the shelter quilt, she found herself thinking about the nature of belief and truth. For years, Marcus had convinced her that her perceptions were unreliable, that her reactions were disproportionate, that her memories were flawed. Now she was discovering that he had extended that same manipulation to her family and friends, creating a narrative in which Grace was unstable and he was the concerned husband trying to help her. It's one of the cruelest parts of abuse, Doctor. Wright explained during their next session when Grace described the conversation with Emma. Abusers don't just hurt their victims, they systematically destroy their credibility and support systems. By the time a woman tries to leave, everyone around her has been conditioned to see the abuser as reasonable and the victim as problematic. So how do I prove that I'm telling the truth? You don't have to prove anything to anyone except yourself, Dr. Wright said gently. Your job right now is to stay safe and prepare for your daughter's arrival. The people who matter will come to understand the truth in their own time. But Grace wasn't sure she had the luxury of waiting for people to understand. Marcus's search efforts were intensifying, and she could feel the walls of her safe haven beginning to feel less secure. Every car that slowed down in front of Haven House made her nervous. Every phone call that came to the shelter's main line made her wonder if Marcus had found a way to trace her location. As Grace put the finishing touches on her quilt square, bare footprints walking away from dark storm clouds toward a bright horizon, she realized that her journey was far from over. Leaving Marcus had been the first step, but staying free would require vigilance, courage, and allies she could trust completely. Looking around the common room at the other women who had become her chosen family, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the strength that comes from being truly understood and unconditionally supported. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she wouldn't face them alone. Detective Lisa Reeves had been investigating domestic violence cases for 8 years, long enough to develop instincts about when situations were more dangerous than they initially appeared. Something about Marcus Martinez's behavior had been bothering her since she first reviewed Grace's case file. The calculated nature of his search efforts, the sophisticated manipulation of Grace's family and friends, the way he seemed to stay just within legal boundaries while maximizing psychological pressure. On Friday morning, 3 weeks after Grace had fled to Haven House, Detective Reeves decided to dig deeper into Marcus's background. What she discovered in a dusty file cabinet in the basement of the county courthouse would change everything about how law enforcement viewed the threat Grace was facing. The file was labeled Martinez Marcus, Death Investigation Closed. It had been transferred from Riverside County in California when Marcus moved to their state 5 years earlier, part of a routine records transfer that had been filed away and forgotten. Detective Reeves almost missed it entirely, finding it only because she had expanded her search to include closed cases and investigations that hadn't resulted in charges. The report, dated 7 years earlier, detailed the death of Marcus's first wife, Rebecca Martinez, who had died from injuries sustained in a fall down a flight of stairs in their apartment building. Rebecca had been 6 months pregnant at the time of her death. Detective Reeves felt her stomach clench as she read the investigating officer's notes. Rebecca Martinez, 24 years old, had been found at the bottom of a concrete stairwell by a neighbor who heard her screaming. She had suffered severe head trauma and internal injuries that had killed both her and her unborn child. Marcus had been at work at the time, with multiple witnesses confirming his alibi. The case had been ruled accidental death after a brief investigation. Rebecca had reportedly been prone to dizzy spells during her pregnancy, and the stairwell was known to be poorly lit and potentially hazardous. There had been no evidence of foul play, no witnesses to suggest anything other than a tragic accident. But as Detective Reeves continued reading, details began to emerge that painted a different picture. Rebecca's medical records, subpoenaed during the investigation, showed a pattern of injuries over the months preceding her death. Bruised ribs that she claimed resulted from falling off a bicycle, a sprained wrist she attributed to catching herself during a stumble, facial bruising she said came from walking into a door in the dark. More troubling were the statements from Rebecca's co-workers and neighbors. Several people mentioned that Rebecca had seemed increasingly isolated in the months before her death, that she had stopped participating in social activities and rarely went anywhere without Marcus. One neighbor reported hearing arguments from their apartment, though she couldn't make out specific words. Most damning was a statement from Rebecca's sister, who told investigators that Rebecca had called her 2 weeks before her death, crying, and saying she was scared of Marcus but couldn't explain why. When the sister had offered to visit, Rebecca had quickly declined, saying Marcus wouldn't like her having company. Detective Reeves cross-referenced the California case with national databases and discovered 2 more incidents from Marcus's past. In college, he had been questioned in connection with a female classmate's apparent suicide, though no charges had been filed. Later, during a brief engagement in his mid-20s, his fiancée had been hospitalized after falling downstairs at her apartment, suffering injuries that ended their relationship and her pregnancy. The pattern was clear to Detective Reeves, even if it hadn't been obvious to investigators who had handled each incident separately across different jurisdictions. Marcus Martinez wasn't just an abusive husband. He was a predator who specifically targeted pregnant women and had a history of violence that escalated to murder. Detective Reeves immediately called Daniel Cruz, knowing that Grace's safety situation had just become exponentially more dangerous. "We need to move Grace immediately," she told Daniel. "Marcus isn't just controlling, he's killed before. His first wife died under suspicious circumstances, and there are other incidents. We're dealing with someone who has made a pattern of hurting pregnant women." Daniel felt ice form in his stomach. "How sure are you about this?" "Sure enough that I'm requesting protective custody for Grace and preparing to reopen Rebecca Martinez's death investigation. We should have caught this when Marcus first moved here, but the records were buried in different systems." Within an hour, Daniel was at Haven House with Maria Santos, Detective Reeves, and 2 additional officers. Grace was in her room, reading a pregnancy book Dr. Chen had recommended, when Maria knocked on her door. "Grace, we need to talk to you about some new information regarding Marcus. Detective Reeves has something important to share." Grace felt her heart rate accelerate as she looked at the serious faces of the people who had become her protectors. "What kind of information?" Detective Reeves sat down carefully, choosing her words with the delicacy the situation required. "We've discovered that Marcus was previously married to a woman named Rebecca, who died 7 years ago. She was pregnant at the time, and while her death was ruled accidental, there are aspects of the case that concern us." Grace stared at Detective Reeves, processing the implications. "He told me he had never been married before. He said I was his first serious relationship. That's not uncommon behavior for someone with Marcus's psychological profile." Detective Reeves continued, "What's more concerning is that Rebecca's death has similarities to other incidents from Marcus's past. We believe you may be in significantly more danger than we initially understood." The room began to feel smaller as Grace absorbed this information. She had known Marcus was controlling and violent, but the idea that he might have killed his previous wife transformed her understanding of what she was facing. "How did she die?" Grace asked quietly. "She fell down a flight of stairs, but Rebecca had been showing signs of abuse for months before her death, and there were indications that she was trying to leave Marcus." Grace's hand moved instinctively to her belly, protecting her daughter from a threat that suddenly seemed more real and immediate. He's going to try to kill me. We're not going to let that happen, Daniel said firmly. But we need to take additional precautions. We're moving you to a more secure location today. Maria explained that Grace would be transferred to a specialized safe house run by the state police, a facility designed for witnesses and victims in extreme danger. The security measures would be more extensive, but so would the restrictions on Grace's movement and communication with the outside world. What about my baby? Grace asked. What happens when I go into labor? What if he finds me at the hospital? Dr. Chen, who had been called to join the meeting, addressed Grace's medical concerns. We'll arrange for you to deliver at a hospital with excellent security protocols. Many of the staff there have experience with high-risk domestic violence cases. Your safety and your baby's safety are our top priorities. As Grace packed her few belongings for the transfer, she felt the weight of understanding that her marriage hadn't just been abusive. It had been potentially fatal from the beginning. Every argument, every incident of violence, every threat had been part of a pattern that had already claimed at least one life. The realization was simultaneously terrifying and validating. For years, Grace had questioned whether her fear was proportionate to the actual danger she faced. Marcus had been skilled at making her feel like she was overreacting, that other women had it worse, that his behavior wasn't really that serious. Now she understood that her instincts had been right all along. The fear that had driven her to plan her escape for months, the panic that had made her flee in the middle of the night, the reluctance to go home that had brought her to tears in front of Officer Cruz, all of it had been her subconscious recognition of a threat that could have killed her. As the secure transport vehicle pulled away from Haven House, Grace looked back at the building that had been her sanctuary for 3 weeks. She was grateful for the safety it had provided, but she also understood that her real journey toward freedom was just beginning. Marcus wasn't just a husband who wouldn't accept rejection. He was a killer who had perfected his methods over years of practice. And now that law enforcement understood the true nature of the threat Grace faced, the stakes of keeping her hidden had become a matter of life and death for both her and her unborn daughter. But for the first time since leaving Marcus, Grace felt like she wasn't fighting this battle alone. She had allies who understood exactly what kind of monster she was hiding from, and they were committed to making sure his pattern of violence ended with her. The state police safe house sat on 20 acres of farmland outside the city, surrounded by open fields that made it impossible for anyone to approach unseen. Grace had been there for 10 days when her daughter decided she was ready to make her entrance into the world. 6 weeks ahead of schedule and in the middle of one of the most dangerous periods of Grace's life. The contractions started at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday, gentle at first, but quickly intensifying in a way that made Grace understand this wasn't false labor. She had been experiencing Braxton Hicks contractions for weeks, but these were different, deeper, more purposeful, accompanied by a pressure that seemed to encompass her entire body. Something's happening, Grace told Agent Sarah Kim, the state police officer assigned to her protection detail. I think I'm in labor. Agent Kim immediately activated the emergency protocol that had been established for exactly this scenario. Dr. Chen was contacted at her home, the hospital security team was notified, and Detective Reeves was called in to coordinate with local law enforcement. How far apart are the contractions? Dr. Chen asked when she arrived at the safe house 30 minutes later. About 5 minutes, Grace said, breathing through another wave of intensity. They're getting stronger fast. Dr. Chen's examination confirmed what Grace already knew. Her daughter was coming today, regardless of whether it was convenient or safe. We need to get you to the hospital now. The baby is presenting well, but this is moving quickly for a first labor. The transport to Regional Medical Center felt like a military operation. Grace rode in an unmarked ambulance with Dr. Chen and Agent Kim, while 2 additional vehicles provided escort. Detective Reeves had coordinated with hospital security to establish a secure perimeter around the maternity ward, and Grace would be registered under an assumed name to prevent Marcus from tracking her through hospital records. But Marcus Martinez had been watching and waiting for exactly this opportunity. For the past month, he had systematically eliminated possible hiding places where Grace might be sheltered. He had conducted surveillance on every women's shelter within a 50-mile radius, noting patterns in security and resident movements. He had bribed a clerk at the courthouse to alert him if any protective orders were filed in Grace's name. Most importantly, he had been monitoring local hospitals for any pregnant women admitted under unusual circumstances. Marcus understood that Grace would eventually need medical care for delivery, and that emergency situations would force her protectors to move her to a facility with limited security options. He had identified Regional Medical Center as the most likely destination because of Dr. Chen's affiliation and the hospital's reputation for handling high-risk pregnancies. For the past week, Marcus had been conducting reconnaissance around the hospital, noting shift changes, security protocols, and the layout of the maternity ward. He had also acquired items that would help him gain access to restricted areas. Scrubs stolen from a medical supply company, a fake ID badge created by a contact in his private investigators network, and a detailed floor plan obtained by claiming to be a prospective patient's family member. As Grace was admitted to the labor and delivery ward under the name Sarah Johnson, Marcus was already in the hospital parking garage, watching the unusual security activity that marked her arrival. "They think they're so clever," Marcus muttered as he observed the coordination between hospital security and law enforcement. "But they have to bring her here eventually, and when they do, she'll remember who she belongs to." Grace's labor progressed rapidly once she reached the hospital. The stress of the past month, combined with the baby's apparent eagerness to arrive, meant that her daughter was going to be born within hours rather than the extended labor typical of first pregnancies. "Everything looks good," Dr. Chen assured Grace as another contraction peaked. "She's in the right position, and you're dilating quickly. We should be holding your daughter before noon." Agent Kim had positioned herself in the hallway outside Grace's room, maintaining visual contact with everyone who approached the labor and delivery ward. The hospital had been cooperative in restricting access to the floor, requiring ID checks and supervisor approval for anyone who wasn't regularly assigned to maternity services. But hospitals were complex environments with hundreds of staff members, multiple access points, and emergency situations that could override normal security protocols. Marcus had studied these vulnerabilities carefully, understanding that chaos created opportunities for someone who knew how to exploit them. At 8:30 in the morning, as Grace entered the most intense phase of labor, Marcus activated his plan. He triggered the fire alarm in the hospital's east wing by setting off smoke detectors in a supply closet, creating an emergency that would draw security personnel away from other areas of the building. As hospital staff responded to the apparent fire emergency, Marcus entered through a service entrance near the loading dock, wearing stolen scrubs and the fake ID badge that identified him as Dr. Michael Rodriguez from the emergency department. He moved through the hospital corridors with the confident purpose of someone who belonged there, taking stairs rather than elevators to avoid surveillance cameras and security checkpoints. Meanwhile, Grace was pushing through contractions that felt like they were tearing her apart, focused entirely on bringing her daughter safely into the world. She was barely aware of the commotion in other parts of the hospital, the fire alarm that had been quickly silenced, or the increased radio chatter among security personnel. "I can see her head," Dr. Chen announced. "Keep pushing, Grace. She's almost here." Marcus reached the maternity ward just as Grace's daughter crowned, timing his arrival for the moment when everyone's attention would be focused on the delivery rather than security. He had studied the ward layout carefully enough to know which room Grace was in, and he moved toward it with the purposeful stride of a medical professional responding to an emergency. Agent Kim was the first to notice something wrong. The man, approaching in scrubs, didn't match any of the medical staff she had been introduced to, and his movement pattern was too focused, too direct for someone making routine rounds. "Excuse me?" Agent Kim called out, positioning herself between Marcus and Grace's room. "Can I see your ID badge?" Marcus smiled the charming smile that had fooled so many people over the years. "Of course. I'm Dr. Rodriguez from Emergency. We received a call about a patient in distress." But Agent Kim had been trained to recognize deception, and something in Marcus's eyes triggered every alarm bell in her professional awareness. "I'm going to need you to step back and wait while I verify your credentials." The smile faded from Marcus's face as he realized his cover had been blown. "I have every right to see my wife," he said, his voice dropping to the cold tone Grace would have recognized immediately. "That's my child being born in there." Agent Kim's hand moved to her weapon as she called for backup on her radio. "Sir, you need to leave this area immediately." Marcus's mask slipped completely as he found himself blocked from reaching Grace in her most vulnerable moment. The careful control he had maintained for weeks evaporated, replaced by the rage of a predator who had been denied his prey. "She belongs to me," Marcus snarled. "That baby belongs to me. You have no right to keep me away from my family." Through the door of her room, Grace heard Marcus's voice and felt terror overwhelm even the intensity of labor. Her daughter's head was crowning. Dr. Chen was encouraging her to push. But all Grace could focus on was the knowledge that Marcus had found her at the moment when she was most helpless. "He's here," Grace gasped between contractions. "Marcus is here." Dr. Chen looked up from her position at the foot of the bed, seeing the panic in Grace's eyes. "Security will handle him. Right now, I need you to focus on your baby. She needs you to finish this." But Grace could hear Marcus's voice, getting louder, more aggressive, as he argued with Agent Kim in the hallway. She could hear other voices joining the confrontation. Hospital security, additional law enforcement, medical staff trying to continue their work despite the chaos. "One more push," Dr. Chen urged. "Grace, your daughter is right there. Don't let him take this moment from you." Grace reached deep inside herself for strength she didn't know she still possessed. She had spent months planning her escape, weeks hiding in safety, and now she was going to meet her daughter while the man who had terrorized her tried to break down the barriers that protected them both. With a primal scream that encompassed years of pain, months of fear, and the fierce love of a mother protecting her child, Grace pushed her daughter into the world. The baby's cry filled the room at the exact moment that Grace heard the sounds of Marcus being restrained and arrested. In the hallway, his shouts of protest, the calm professional voices of law enforcement, the click of handcuffs being applied. "She's perfect," Dr. Chen said, placing the baby on Grace's chest. "Your daughter is absolutely perfect." Grace looked down at the tiny face of her child, the daughter she had protected by leaving everything she knew, the daughter who had given her the courage to finally save herself. The baby's eyes were wide and alert, as if she understood that her arrival had marked not just the beginning of her own life, but the end of her mother's captivity. In the hallway, Marcus was being led away by Detective Reeves and two uniformed officers, his charming facade completely shattered as he screamed threats and accusations. But for the first time in years, his voice held no power over Grace. She was surrounded by people who had risked their careers and their safety to protect her, holding a daughter who represented hope and freedom and the possibility of a life without fear. "What's her name?" Dr. Chen asked as she completed the delivery procedures. Grace looked at her daughter's face, thinking of the long journey that had brought them to this moment. "Hope," she said without hesitation. "Her name is Hope." The hospital bracelet around Grace's wrist bore the name Sarah Johnson, but as she held her newborn daughter against her chest, she felt more like herself than she had in years. Hope weighed 6 pounds, 3 ounces, small but healthy, with dark hair like her mother's and eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with calm curiosity. Marcus's arrest in the hallway had created chaos that rippled through the maternity ward. Hospital security was conducting a floor-by-floor sweep to ensure he hadn't brought accomplices, while Detective Reeves coordinated with the district attorney's office about the charges that would be filed. Breaking and entering, attempted kidnapping, violation of protective orders, and stalking, Detective Reeves explained to Grace during a brief visit to her recovery room. Plus, we're reopening the investigation into his first wife's death. The California authorities are very interested in what we've discovered. Grace nodded, but her attention was focused primarily on Hope, who was nursing with the determined efficiency of someone who had decided the outside world was acceptable. After all, after months of fear about how trauma might affect her ability to bond with her baby, Grace was relieved to find that maternal love felt as natural as breathing. "What happens now?" Grace asked. "Will they keep him in jail?" The judge set his bail at $500,000, which should keep him locked up for the immediate future. "But Grace, I need you to understand that this isn't over. Men like Marcus don't give up easily, and the fact that he now has a child to use as leverage makes him more dangerous, not less." Dr. Chen entered the room carrying a chart and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose patient had just delivered a healthy baby under impossible circumstances. "How are we feeling?" "Tired but good," Grace said honestly. "She's amazing." "She certainly is. Strong lungs, good reflexes, no complications from the early delivery." "You did beautifully." Dr. Chen checked Grace's vital signs and made notes in her chart. "I want to keep you both for observation for at least 2 days, partly for medical reasons and partly because it gives security more time to ensure your safety." Agent Kim appeared in the doorway, looking more relaxed than she had since Grace's. Labor began. "The floor is secure. We've increased the security detail, and hospital administration has agreed to limit access to this wing to essential personnel only." "Thank you," Grace said, meaning it completely. "All of you, I know this isn't what you signed up for when you took your jobs." "Actually," Agent Kim said with a smile, "protecting people who need protection is exactly what I signed up for. And seeing that little one makes it all worthwhile." Hope chose that moment to open her eyes and look directly at Agent Kim, as if acknowledging the role this stranger had played in ensuring her safe arrival into the world. But while Grace was surrounded by protectors and beginning to bond with her daughter, Marcus was in a holding cell 15 miles away, planning his next moves with the methodical focus that had made him dangerous from the beginning. The arrest had been humiliating but not unexpected. Marcus had known that attempting to reach Grace at the hospital was risky, but he had also understood that childbirth would be his best opportunity to access her when she was most vulnerable. "I want to see my lawyer," Marcus told the booking officer for the 3rd time, "and I want to call my wife's family. They need to know that she's being held against her will by people who are manipulating her mental illness." Marcus's lawyer, Robert Chen, no relation to Grace's doctor, was a criminal defense attorney who specialized in domestic relations cases. Chen had a reputation for aggressive advocacy and creative interpretations of parental rights law. "The charges against you are serious," Chen told Marcus during their initial consultation, "but the prosecution's case has some weaknesses we can exploit. Your wife left voluntarily. She's been hiding your child from you for months, and there's no direct evidence that you intended to harm anyone at the hospital." "What about the other charges?" The detective mentioned reopening some investigation in California. "That's concerning, but not insurmountable. 7-year-old cases are difficult to prosecute, especially when they were originally ruled accidental deaths. Unless they have new evidence, it's mostly circumstantial." Marcus felt some of his confidence returning. He had navigated legal challenges before, and he understood that the system was often more interested in resolving cases than pursuing perfect justice. "What about my parental rights?" Marcus asked. "That's my daughter, and I have every legal right to be involved in decisions about her care and custody." "That's actually our strongest angle," Chen agreed. Regardless of the domestic violence allegations, you're the child's biological father. The court will have to consider your parental rights, especially if we can demonstrate that your wife's mental state makes her an unfit parent. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Grace was learning to navigate the complex emotions that came with new motherhood while still processing the trauma of Marcus's attempted intrusion. Hope was sleeping peacefully in her arms, but Grace found herself startling at every sound in the hallway, every voice that wasn't immediately familiar. "This is normal," Dr. Wright told her when he arrived for an impromptu counseling session. "You've just given birth under extremely stressful circumstances. Your nervous system is going to be hypervigilant for a while." "I keep thinking about what would have happened if he had gotten into the room," Grace admitted. "If Agent Kim hadn't stopped him, if security hadn't been there." "But they were there," Dr. Wright interrupted gently, "and they did stop him. You're safe, Hope is safe, and Marcus is in custody. Try to focus on what actually happened rather than what might have happened." Grace nodded, but the fear was persistent. She understood intellectually that she was protected, but years of living with Marcus had taught her that safety was temporary and danger was always waiting for the right moment to strike. That evening, as visiting hours ended and the hospital settled into its nighttime routine, Grace received an unexpected visitor. Emma, her sister, appeared in the doorway, looking uncertain and emotional. "Grace, I hope it's okay that I came. I heard about the baby, and I wanted to see if you were all right." Grace studied her sister's face, looking for signs of judgment or Marcus's influence. Instead, she saw genuine concern and what might have been the beginning of understanding. "How did you know I was here?" "Detective Reeves called me. She said Marcus tried to get to you during labor and that he's been arrested." "Grace, I'm so sorry. I didn't understand. I thought he was just worried about you." Emma approached the bed slowly, her eyes taking in the hospital security bracelet, the careful way Grace positioned herself protectively around Hope, the exhaustion that went deeper than new motherhood. "Can I see her?" Emma asked softly. Grace hesitated for a moment, then shifted Hope so her sister could get a better look. "Her name is Hope. She's beautiful. She looks like you did when you were born." Emma's voice caught slightly. "Grace, Detective Reeves told me some things about Marcus's past, about his first wife. I had no idea. When you called me before, I should have listened better. Marcus is very good at making people believe what he wants them to believe," Grace said without bitterness. "He had me convinced that my own perceptions were wrong for years." "How long has he been hurting you?" "Almost from the beginning of our marriage. It started small, controlling where I went, who I talked to, what I wore. Then it became emotional abuse, isolation, and eventually physical violence. The pregnancy made it worse, because he saw it as a way to trap me permanently." Emma sat in the chair beside Grace's bed, tears running down her face as she processed years of missed signs and ignored instincts. "I should have known. I should have seen what was happening. He made sure no one would see," Grace said gently. "That's what abusers do. They isolate their victims and create narratives that make everyone else complicit in the abuse." Hope stirred in Grace's arms, making the small sounds that new babies use to communicate their needs. Grace adjusted her position and began the gentle rocking motion that seemed to calm her daughter immediately. "What happens now?" Emma asked. "With Marcus in jail, with the baby, what's your plan?" Grace looked down at Hope's peaceful face and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The confidence that came from making decisions based on love rather than fear. "I'm going to raise my daughter somewhere safe," Grace said simply. "I'm going to make sure she never has to learn to read someone's moods to determine whether she's in danger. I'm going to teach her that love doesn't come with conditions or control." Emma reached out and gently touched Hope's tiny hand. "I want to help, if you'll let me. I want to be the aunt she deserves and the sister I should have been to you." For the first time since Hope's birth, Grace felt tears of relief rather than fear. Her family was beginning to understand the truth. Marcus was in custody, and her daughter was healthy and safe in her arms. But outside the hospital, Robert Chen was already working on a legal strategy that would challenge Grace's right to keep Hope away from her biological father, regardless of the circumstances that had led to their separation. Hope's first cry pierced through the chaos in the hospital hallway like a declaration of victory. As Grace held her daughter for the first time, she could hear Marcus being led away in handcuffs, his voice fading as Detective Reeves and her officers escorted him toward the elevator. "She's perfect," Dr. Chen said, completing her examination. "Of the baby, 10 fingers, 10 toes, and lungs that work beautifully." Grace laughed through her tears, the first genuine laughter she had experienced in months. She certainly announced her arrival effectively. Agent Kim appeared in the doorway, her professional composure softened by a smile. "The suspect is in custody and being transported to county jail. The floor is secure, and you're both safe." The word "safe" hung in the air like a benediction. Grace repeated it silently, testing how it felt to believe it completely for the first time in years. Safe. She was safe. Hope was safe, and Marcus could no longer use his voice or his presence to control their lives. Hope chose that moment to open her eyes and look directly at Grace, as if studying the face of the woman who had protected her from conception to birth. The baby's gaze was alert and somehow knowing, carrying none of the fear that had defined Grace's pregnancy. "I think she's trying to tell you something," Dr. Chen observed. Grace looked into her daughter's dark eyes and felt a communication that went beyond words. "I think she's saying thank you for getting us both out of there, for choosing her safety over everything else." Detective Reeves returned with updates on Marcus's legal situation. He's been charged with multiple felonies, and the judge denied bail pending a psychological evaluation. The district attorney's office is treating this as a high-priority case. As the hospital settled into its nighttime quiet, Grace lay in her bed, holding hope and marveling at how completely her life had changed. Yesterday she had been a frightened pregnant woman in hiding. Today she was a mother, free from the man who had terrorized her for years. Hope stirred in her arms, and Grace began humming a lullaby her own mother had sung to her years ago. "Your daddy can't hurt us anymore," Grace whispered to her sleeping daughter. "You're going to grow up knowing that love means safety, not control. You're going to learn that your voice matters, that your choices are your own." Hope's breathing settled into the deep rhythm of infant sleep, and Grace allowed herself to drift toward rest for the first time in months, without fear of what tomorrow might bring. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain in its details, but clear in its promise. 3 months later, Grace Sullivan sat in her transitional housing apartment, watching Hope practice the determined movements that would soon become crawling. At 3 months old, Hope was a healthy, alert baby who approached the world with curiosity rather than caution. On the coffee table sat a small wooden box containing mementos from Grace's journey. Hope's hospital bracelet, her intake form from Haven House, a square of fabric from the shelter's community quilt featuring bare footprints walking towards sunshine. And most recently, a copy of the newspaper article announcing Marcus's conviction and sentencing. Marcus had been found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 25 years in prison. The California authorities had also successfully prosecuted him for Rebecca's murder, adding another 20 years. At 41, Marcus would be eligible for parole when he was in his 80s. The conviction had brought Grace unexpected closure. During her victim impact statement, she had spoken not just about her own suffering, but about Rebecca's lost life and the children who would now grow up safe. "You stole years of my life," Grace had told Marcus from the witness stand. "You stole Rebecca's entire life, but you did not steal my daughter's future." Now, as Hope gurgled happily on her playmat, Grace reflected on how completely their lives had changed. She had started working part-time as a victim advocate at Haven House, using her experience to help other women navigate leaving abusive relationships. "Your mama helps other mamas stay safe," Grace told Hope during their morning routine. "And someday, when you're old enough to understand, I'll tell you about the brave thing we did together." Hope responded with a smile that lit up her entire face, reaching toward Grace with complete trust. There had been no signs that Hope had been affected by the stress of Grace's pregnancy. No feeding difficulties, no excessive crying, no trauma that sometimes affected children born in dangerous circumstances. Officer Daniel Cruz had become a regular presence in their lives, checking in weekly and bringing small gifts for Hope. Daniel had been promoted to detective partly based on his work on Grace's case. "You changed my perspective on this job," Daniel had told Grace. "Before I met you, I thought domestic violence cases were just about documenting incidents. Now I understand they're about saving lives and breaking cycles." Grace's relationship with her family had healed slowly but completely. Emma visited twice a week, helping with Hope, and gradually learning about domestic abuse realities she had missed. Grace's parents had flown in from Arizona, spending 2 weeks helping Grace settle into her new apartment. "She has your determination," Grace's mother had observed, watching Hope work persistently to roll over. "She's going to be a force to be reckoned with." Grace hoped that was true. She wanted Hope to grow up with confidence, to trust her own instincts, strength to walk away from situations that didn't serve her, and wisdom to surround herself with people who loved her unconditionally. As evening approached, Grace prepared Hope's bottle and settled into the rocking chair Emma had bought for the nursery. This was their quiet time, when Grace would sing lullabies and talk to Hope about their day, their future, the people who loved them. "Today we helped Mrs. Peterson at the shelter understand her legal options," Grace told Hope as she settled in. "To nurse. She's scared, like Mama was scared, but she's going to be brave like we were brave." Hope's eyes drooped as she nursed, her small body relaxing completely in Grace's arms. This was the peace Grace had dreamed of during those terrifying months of planning her escape, the simple joy of holding her child without fear, without calculation, without wondering what punishment might follow this moment of happiness. As Hope fell asleep, Grace placed her gently in the crib and stood watching her daughter's peaceful breathing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, Grace was exactly where she wanted to be, in a safe home with a healthy daughter, surrounded by people who supported her choices and respected her strength. She thought briefly of the woman she had been 3 months ago, sitting barefoot on a park bench, with nothing but fear and hope. That woman would be amazed to see where courage had led them. Not to a perfect life, but to a real life, chosen freely and lived authentically. Grace turned off the nursery light and headed toward her own bedroom, pausing to lock the front door, not from fear, but from simple security consciousness. Tomorrow, Hope would wake up in a world where her mother's voice was strong, where love meant safety, and where the future held infinite possibilities for a little girl who would never have to learn to read someone's moods to determine whether she was safe. For Grace, that knowledge was worth everything she had endured to achieve it.